This episode of ChatGPD was made possible by the hard work and creativity of our production team. A huge thank you to Chris Sang, Alakia Chandran, and Shakoyak Forazan for their expert production, editing, and behind the scenes magic that brings each conversation to life. We also want to thank Saratoga and the IMS for their support in helping us share ideas, stories, and resources that empower our grad students at every stage of their journey. Hello, and welcome to another episode of ChatGPD, our podcast on careers in biomedical science. My name's Pamela Plant, and I'm the Director of Graduate Professional Development at the Institute of Medical Science here at the University of Toronto. And today I'm joined by Paul Turgeon, who is the Associate Director of Scientific and Competitive Analysis at Takeda. Welcome, Paul.
Nice to be. Hi, great to see you again, Pam.
Great to see you. I'm really excited to talk to you today because you've had a recent role change and you've been, in my view, wearing two different sides of analyst slash consultant in your current role and in your past role. So if you don't mind, we're going to talk about both roles today because these are roles that a lot of our graduate students and postdocs are wanting to go into, which is consulting, pharma and biotech consulting, as well as competitive analysis, scientific analysis. So we're going to explore both of those roles.
Sounds good. I'll try to keep them separated, and when there's differences, I'll try to highlight them. And glad to do so.
Thanks, Paul. So instead of starting at today's job, we're going to backtrack and start at your first role out of your postdoc. And that is as a consultant with a biopharma consulting firm in the US. And again, big transition from the graduate degree at University of Toronto in molecular sciences. Can you start from your PhD and what you did to get to that role in management in consulting?
For sure. Yeah, so during my PhD, it was actually one of the other grad students that highlighted consulting. And she wanted to get sort of a team in the lab and do one of those case competitions. So that was an interesting case competition because they actually paired us with an MBA from York. So I think it was maybe a 2-week competition. We did it in the lab at St. Mike's. We presented it here in the pharmacy building. And I thought it was a great experience. I think it was brought up mainly because I had a bit of a business background, my parents being bankers, so I had some understanding of business. One of the other things that we ended up getting was the mini MBA program from GMCA at St. Mike's, so we did that, which also helped. And between those, I guess, aspects of like learning about what consulting generally is, I then started to volunteer with the consulting clubs at U of T. So I think there's UCG, they might have changed names by now, and
I think it's the same. University Consulting Group.
Yeah, and there's another one.
GMCA.
GMCA, yes.
Graduate Management Consulting Group.
Correct. Yeah. So I did some more or less longer projects with them. So with them, it was sort of a similar interview to what you'd actually do at Clear when I started biomedical consulting, where I went in, they had some sort of behavioral questions, and then we sort of did a case study live, which generally is sort of a bit of a back and forth. Most consultancies will do it as a back and forth discussion where you're given a prompt about some kind of business case, and then you walk through your reasoning and what you want to learn, or maybe aspects you want to dive into, and the information you sort of gain from that will help you make a recommendation. And in a nutshell, that case competition, and that's also what it was for the case competition, it's also usually the standard interview. There's slight variability in how consultancies do these interviews, and that's pretty much what the job is too, right? You don't necessarily see the project that's sold, but ultimately you get rolled on or brought on as part of the project. Here's the problem we're trying to solve, and you just go find the information rather than having a conversation to get the information out of someone like you would in an interview. So I think from there, I like the aspect of, I know I can dive as deep into the science as needed, but I also knew I had enough of the background in business to sort of get myself through and figured out on the fly. And that's particularly why I did more like the biotech pharma consulting, was I wanted to stay a bit closer to the science because I felt like that was an asset that I had and could bring to the role.
And I think a lot of students, and maybe you can relate to this as well, although you did say you had bankers as parents. So I think the the thinking for a lot of students is that they don't have the business language, and therefore they're somehow ill-equipped to go into these consulting roles, which is so the opposite. I mean, the way I kind of view it, maybe naively, is that consulting is much like the questioning that you do for your experimentation in your PhD. It's just applied to a business or some kind of a managerial question, um, and it's applied to a different sector. Is that a fair assessment? And what do you think is a way that the PhDs can position themselves for applying to these jobs and getting them to realize that they do possess the skills that they can thrive in these roles?
Yeah, for sure. As much as I've had parents that were bankers, a lot of even just the thought process was there. When you think about, any kind of big company marketing something, you realize who they're marketing to. You start to think about those questions. So I feel like a lot of advanced degrees understand the reasoning behind the way businesses in our daily lives do things. You might hear of the TTC debating hiking fares and the fact that, oh, they're running a deficit, right? And it's like, well, okay, if I make more money, I can deal with the deficit or things like that. So a lot of times just having that general sense of the world is enough to get you started. Sure, you may not have the lingo to talk through assets and liabilities, right? But I mean, from a student perspective, you may make a stipend, you may have some OSAP loans, right? Like there is a differential, right? Like you're thinking generally in those terms already. And there are projects for sure that lend heavy on the science, right? A company is debating developing a drug in a certain area. You have to understand the disease, or you might have to understand how the drug works. And that's to me very leverageable from what you do in your PhD.
Yeah.
And then I think having these sort of other resources around U of T are very much helpful, right? If you're worried about being able to speak the lingo, there's courses you can take. I think those also would help to have on your resume to show that you're trying to understand the business. Most consultancies that are hiring advanced degrees know you're not necessarily always going to be a huge business background person, but most of them realize and think about the fact that you have an enormous intellectual horsepower that comes with doing an advanced degree and the ability to speak to high up people, right? When you think about it, you defend your thesis in front of people that may have even discovered the genes you worked on, right? So being comfortable and getting comfortable in those situations helps, because I've presented to CSOs, the chief scientific officers, where I was a bit scared in the fact that they probably know a bit more of the science than me. And then I presented to CEOs where I've said, hey, I did my PhD in this. And he said, you probably know more than most people at the company, right? Other than the science people. So the idea that you have this power to go figure something out, and really that's what your PhD is founded on. The idea that you're trying to answer a question no one knows, so you're going to have to find information to support you as you go. So if you don't know the business, you can easily figure it out.
Yeah. Do an experiment on yourself and solve that hypothesis.
Yeah.
And do you think it's fair to say that PhDs in biomedical sciences are sought after in biotech and pharma consulting firms?
I would definitely say yes.
Yeah. So having that extra degree, it's not just about MBAs. It's about
it's not.
people that have been in the trenches doing the science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The MBAs bring their own flavor, right? If you're working as a part of a private equity portion of a biotech or a pharma, right? A lot of pharmas have venture capital pieces or arms or however. So like an MBA could be better served over there, but sometimes I've worked on projects where it was, hey, here's the science. Where do we go with this? Or, one company I distinctly remember, I think they were only around for a year. and they had literally said, we have this new technology and we got to go forward in one particular type of cancer. Like which do we go forward and why? Right? Because you have to then understand, well, here's why your science is unique. Here's where there's a gap in the ability that your science can fill, right? And then you also then, once again, you still have to think of the bit of the business, right? If this is a bit of a higher risk, but maybe a bigger reward kind of opportunity, or is this a lower risk? Maybe you don't make as much money, but it keeps you going. So you have to also understand a little bit of that kind of flavor.
Can we backtrack to your own story? You were at University of Toronto, you finished your PhD, you had a colleague in the lab that was looking into consulting. You knew that you obviously wanted to go in that direction. You had gathered all these experiences through consulting groups at the university. And then you go to the US. So there's a lot to unpack there. I'd like you to talk about your choice to go to the US, how easy it was for you to get employment in the US as a Canadian, and what that first transition was like for you.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the choice to go to the US, and it's actually why I even picked Boston, was the fact that our lab was pretty fortunate that we did have a collaboration with Harvard. So I knew there was a lot of interesting science going on over there. A lot of the work we did, we sort of followed stuff from Harvard, MIT, the Broad Institute. So I was always a little bit excited about that. And that's one of the reasons. I think the other piece being there's just a larger biotech and pharmaceutical presence. For me at the time, I was actually more interested in smaller biotechs. They just tend to have a lot more options, and just more intriguing science that I was hoping that I could leverage a lot of what I did in my PhD to do. Interestingly, there are now a few companies in and around Boston that do what I did in my PhD. And I think the transition to going into the US itself wasn't too complicated. Some companies will specifically state that they will not sponsor a visa. I find generally management consulting firms are usually pretty flexible on that. There are certain visas that are a little bit easier to get, and some management consulting firms are able to get those. So that's the route sort of I took, that luckily the company would sponsor it. There are other visas that you can also get, you can apply for yourselves. If I would suggest go looking into them, but some of them you can leverage the fact that you might be a very knowledgeable like opinion leader in the space you work in, or that you're highly published and decorated. The fact that you are, maybe a well sought after scientist can also help you get visas, and that can at least start the point of going, because you really need the visa to then be able to be employed.
When you were at at your first company, Clearview, how long were you there?
So I was at Clearview for, I think, just over 4 years.
4 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And can you describe what that job was like? What was that initial transition like for you? From university consulting group to the real thing, big consulting firm in Boston. How was that transition for you, and what were those projects like?
Yeah, I think I would generally say for a lot of PhDs, and I would say myself, someone included, the transition still can be somewhat challenging, right? The idea that, in your PhD, you're usually trying to understand very nuanced and very subtle changes and differences, and making sure you understand that and you can convey that and that those nuances are important. That doesn't always necessarily apply in consulting. Consulting is generally sort of like the 80-20 rule of you're going to get 80% of your answer right very quickly, and the other 20% probably is not always going to be as useful. So to be able to understand that and say, I think I've found enough of an answer, it's time to move on, rather than knowing everything about it, because it's not usually going to help you when you're trying to, talk through these things. Most times you're not working with the CSO. A lot of times big pharmaceutical companies have so many arms, they just can't do everything themselves, that they will hire consulting firms or have very specific projects that they want sort of solved. So to know when you know enough is, I think, the biggest and the hardest piece to learn. And I would say, what was done at the university consulting groups does have a bit of a feel for it. You're working on a team, you're generally communicating with like amongst the team for what people are doing and what aspect of the project they're working on, when it will be done, and your project reporting to a project lead. Company, the way Clearview works is very similar, where we would be put on a project and we would have a project lead, and then we would also then have an extended leadership team, which would typically be the ones that sold the project to the client. So I would say the day-to-day is very, although the day-to-day is sort of similar if you were to take what you did here in the consulting groups and compress them, right? Because you're always working on it, you're always sort of generating data, slides, Excels. You're always checking in with your project lead to make sure, hey, is this right? Is this the way we want to tell the story? You're also trying to make sure you're answering the question, because you also sort of start to partition a project out. You're not gonna, there might be a handful of questions you have to answer, or there might be one big question, but you answer it in several parts. So thinking about it in like those terms, and then making sure the leadership member that sold the project, make sure that's aligned with the way they see it, because it's almost like having a PI or your prof working with you, right? They've been in the space usually for a long time. That's why they're able to sell these projects. So they can almost sense check in a way what you found. Does it fit? Does it just make sense to start with? Is it clear? Because also it's nice to have someone, just like in your PhD, when you're in the trenches all the day doing the individual experiments, you don't necessarily want to go to a committee member and talk to why this one specific assay didn't work, all right? You want to give them that higher level. So it also gives them a chance to make sure everything flows and works together, and it forces you to make sure you're thinking logically of like how I'm going to tell the story, because it might be very complex and you have to make sure it's simplified, because not all of your clients are going to have a heavy science background. Some of them might not even have a heavy business background, but to be able to make it palatable in a way.
Yeah. Can you describe some of the, maybe not the specifics, I don't know if there's confidentiality, but give us a flavor of some of the projects that you worked on in that first consulting role?
Sure. Yeah, I can't really go into specifics. I can say that I've worked some diagnostics. I can say that I've worked with like large pharmaceuticals. I've worked from like very early stage biotechs and some biotechs that have been somewhat established as well. There's usually, I would say, a big variety of projects. So some of the ones that might be more sciencey, or what we call like indication triages, right? Company has launched a drug or is going to launch a drug. They want to understand, okay, now that we might be generating money from this drug, can we leverage the science to go into another disease? So you're trying to create a universe of diseases where that particular drug and like how it works may also be valuable, and you're trying to then narrow that down. So the project we worked on, we started with like 100 different potential diseases, and we said like, okay, is there scientific rationale to go here? Yes or no, or on a scale, right? Which would be how the drug works. Is there clinical rationale? There's no sense in developing a drug when you can just, pay for a very cheap generic drug that will easily do the job, right? Is there some kind of competitive? So now you start to think of the business side. Are big companies developing here? Yes, that could be a good thing, and it could be a bad thing, right? Are no companies working, right? Like, are no companies working here because it's too hard to build something here in this disease? Or is it just because no one's thought to do it, right? Same thing with large companies. Is it only one large company doing it? Maybe because they want to be first and they think there's some science, or are there like 5 or 6, right? Like, you also have to wonder, if we were to be successful, what would that look like? And then from that, then trying to then narrow it down to, we tried to get it ultimately down to 5. And it's through conversations with the client where we would talk through, okay, here's sort of 20 that we're thinking of on a 1-page PowerPoint slide. Here's why we're thinking that. Have sort of discussions with the client. Sometimes their scientific team will be brought in. You have to have some discussions. And then, aligning and discussing with that client to figure, okay, I think these next 5 will be the ones we actually look into, and then sort of develop our recommendation there. So that's a bit more on the sciencey side. there are other ones. I've worked in gene therapies where we were just trying to understand, would a doctor even use this? So for a lot of those kinds of projects, we're speaking to KOLs, physicians. You're trying to then think about, okay, could this be used in an academic setting, right? Is it very complex to administer, or could community doctors use it too? How do you go about understanding the, although they are a bit more nuanced, who's using it, why would they want to use it? So just trying to get a feel for that. A lot of the projects we do, we also try to then, they're generally called, we would call them opportunity assessments, trying to understand if we go into this space or we're developing this space, what does it look like in terms of, revenue potential. So a lot of times you have to speak with physicians to say, okay, would you use this? Which patients would you use it in? Why? You're trying to speak with insurance providers, companies, and trying to get a feel for how much they would be willing to pay, right? So you have to have a feel for,
So that's much more the business
right.
side. So you're saying in that management consulting role, what would that divide be between kind of more utilizing your scientific expertise and then looking at more the business side and consulting from a business perspective?
So I'd say it's a mix. So I distinctly remember learning about the insurance kind of businessy side because the second project I was ever on, that's what I was in charge of.
Wow. Okay.
So it was almost
So
a
you can
like,
get thrown right into that, even though you don't have that business background.
right. And
Yeah.
like, there's usually in consulting, you're almost always on a team. Even if you're not on a team, there's other people on within your firm that are willing to like lend a hand and like give you a flavor for how this works or what they're thinking
Yeah,
of.
so you're not left in isolation.
No,
They're
not at all.
experts, subject matter experts that you can, tap into.
Yeah.
So
And
you
like,
can get up to speed pretty quickly.
and for me, like once I actually spoke to someone on the team, it made clinical sense, right? The way you think about, to me, I was told the way to think about it is if you develop a drug, its value is sort of what an insurance company would save. So are you saving, a patient from being hospitalized? Are you saving them from going on other drugs? Right? Because all those will cost money. So you can sort of then start to then think, oh yeah, that sort of makes sense
Yeah.
scientifically, in my opinion, or clinically. That's an easy way to think about it.
So you're at this big management consulting firm, and you've pivoted now to Takeda and scientific and competitive analysis. So I think of it as taking all that vast experience and problem solving in the management consulting role and applying it to the company. So you're kind of like an in-house consultant. And tell me about that transition and what motivated that transition and how your job differs. Do you like it more? Do you like that kind of fast pace and the different, like the dynamic nature of being in the consulting role and having all those different projects roll across your desk? Or now you're really focused on the one company, your timelines are longer. What is that transition like?
Yeah, I would say that the transition there was also interesting. Um, in pharmaceuticals and like biotech, a lot of times you are thinking on the range of years, right? So, whereas in consulting, it's like, I need to get this project done by next month,
Yeah.
right? So you're trying to find an answer very quickly. And I did like the aspects of, oh, today we're going to be working, or this month we're working on a gene therapy. That's cool. Sort of here's the gene therapy lay of the land. Here's sort of what's out there, understanding how this might look in terms of how gene therapy has emerged, how other companies have gone forward making their own gene therapies. And then to roll on to something where it was, not necessarily a genetic disease. And now starting to think of, right. So I would say I do like the focused aspect of what I currently do. So generally what I do now is more focused to only a handful of diseases, but I'm supposed to be almost a subject matter expert from the sort of science standpoint, at least for what I'm working on, but also understanding sort of the commercial aspects. There in consulting, almost always like you have to go figure it all out yourself and be able to tell the story. And yes, we used to do, let's say, physician calls or surveys, or sometimes we'd speak to, like I said, the insurance people. I've spoken to policy people that have instituted policies across different countries and how that's influenced things. Whereas here we have a lot more resources in like a pharmaceutical company internal. So last week, as an example, we had the clinical, the medical, I think we also had the regulatory people all weigh in. We also had to bring in some of the commercial people to say, hey, there's some information that's come out. What do we make of this? How does that change our approach maybe to the trial we're going to start in a few years? Should we be thinking of this? And when you have to do that, you now might have to consider, oh, we might have to add this extra drug to the trial. That changes the forecast you then have. Because pharmaceuticals are generally thinking on that long scale.
Yeah.
So you then have to also change or have discussions around that. So I would say in a pharmaceutical biotech company, a lot of times you're having more conversations around making sure everyone sort of is aligned with the way you're thinking and getting their opinions, and making sure if someone were to ask us a question, whether they ask it of the clinical team or me, we would come out with the same answer. Whereas in consulting, you're sort of trying to solve individual pieces of a project and bring that forward. So you're owning it. So in both cases, there's ownership of part of the project, but just because it's a bit more complex sometimes when you're thinking, over the next 10 years when this drug might come out, what are we doing, and how is clinical people that are actually treating patients, how have they seen things evolve? What do they anticipate? What do they see problems that we're not seeing just from the science standpoint? Are they seeing safety issues maybe that we're not aware of that physicians are complaining about?
Yeah. So both are strategy
Yep.
oriented, but timeline is different, quick, long term. And then it just sounds like with the company and being in house, you are really drawing on all of those facets of the company, and not just kind of from a, the ideas generation or problem solving. It's you're taking all of the factors of that company into consideration, that maybe would be different than consulting.
Yeah.
You don't.
And I would say there are some consulting firms that will do sort of longer term projects. I know people that have worked on, 6-month projects at my old company. They weren't as frequent. And those ones the general approach is still the same. And you may sort of starting to think of these things. But here it's almost purely focused on these things. And like slight changes, you're trying to predict how good a competitor is going to do in a different drug class that has different targets. And all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm only looking at, their early phase 1 data for like some kind of signal, and trying to figure out, are they going to be better than us, right? And like you're trying to compare apples to apples. You can't always do that.
Yeah.
And it's so early, it doesn't really reflect what's going to happen later, but you're trying to at least make some kind of informed decisions. So because of that complexity, it's better to have like a lot more opinions brought in.
Sounds like I'm thinking about our listeners and like people, students and postdocs that are envisioning potential careers for their future. In terms of lifestyle, I mean, is the is the whole specter of, consulting, having zero life, you're always beholden to the client, you're working, 16-hour days. Is that really a myth, or is that the reality of that lifestyle? And then what you're doing now, you're kind of in-house, your scientific competitive analysis, is this a better lifestyle? Are you working the hours that you used to in consulting?
So I would say to answer the consulting question, there's probably a sliding scale.
Yeah.
Maybe
Is it dependent on the size of the firm, or is it the intensity of the project?
It may be dependent on the size of the firm. I'm not 100% sure. I think it's generally dependent on the intensity of the project and like the timelines that are sold or the urgency behind it. So I know people that worked 100-hour work weeks for quite a while. I myself have had to work 80-hour work weeks for like a month and a half. and that was more, we were doing more of like a due diligence. Um, and I mean, it's a challenge, 80-hour work week. I think I would get up at 8 and go to bed at 2 in the morning and then just get up and do it again. Um, it was interesting because that one had a scientific conference near the end. So the client came back like, oh, wait, can you go speak to these doctors you spoke to already and see how their opinions have changed now that there's this other data? And then revisit the forecast we had developed to say, here's what we think this drug might be worth, right? Um, so it has a scale, right? Like sometimes you're signing off at 7, sometimes that's not the case. But I would generally say that part of the draw to consulting for me was also the idea that you could pack a lot of learning because there's just so much that has to be done and you have to figure it out. And because of that, and you get a broad range of experiences. It's almost very much like miniature cases where I've had to do marketing. Okay, now I've learned some marketing stuff. Interesting. I can build on that later if I get another marketing project. I've had to help figure out how you're gonna target your drug launch to like be efficient.
Right.
Right. I've had
Then
to,
there's regulatory,
right.
and then you dip your toes into, some other
So like
aspect of,
you get a good lay of the land of like
Yeah.
all the
yeah,
aspects that might be
great training ground, right?
exactly.
Would you recommend it for a lot of PhDs that as a first stop out of their degrees to just kind of get that breadth of experience? Because then your options open up of where you go next.
So that was my approach, was the fact that I knew it could open a fair number of options. And I was willing to risk the fact that I knew it was going to be longer days just to be able to get that experience very quickly.
Is it a young person's game? Are these consulting firms like 20 and 30-year-olds? Do you find any like 50 and 60-year-olds in consulting? Or are they upper management?
Yeah,
They're not
usually
pulling
by
those
that point
80-hour
they're upper
works?
management usually. But I mean, I've worked with a fair number of PhDs, and I know some of them, like me, I got into the PhD game a little late. So I know there were some that were a little bit older as well. You can do it because you're doing it day in, day out. Your brain just adapts. It's fine. But I would say pharmaceutical, maybe not much. I mean, I've heard mixed stories in biotech, but I know like pharmaceutical, because they're thinking on longer scales, they generally have very reproducible sort of cycles. Every 3 months, we sort of readjust our forecast as we need to, but we only do the next 2 years of forecasting. Every half year, we do, our long range forecasts based on what's changed, things like that. When I started the pharmaceutical job, the guy I was learning from said, I don't really respond to Teams messages that are urgent because it's so cyclical. Sort of have a good feel for when things are coming, when you have to be doing certain, like you could even mark them on your calendars. Like, and if you have to engage someone else, you don't want to be asking him on a Wednesday that I need this by Friday. And that's part of the nature of the job too, that I currently do. You get a lot of random asks of people, I need this, I need that, right? And sometimes if you come in too late, it's like, I got to do 3 other things that just came on my plate last week. I just don't have time for you. Sorry, right? So because it's more internal, you can at least give a little bit of pushback on timelines. Consulting, because it's a bit more of a service industry, you always want to meet those deadlines because clients assume you're going to always hit them.
Yeah.
But I would say the lifestyle now is fairly easier in the fact that I can rely on some other people to pick up the slack. If, like me taking a day off, hey guys, I can forward you a few emails if needed. Can you just check these things for me? That's great, right? Whereas in consulting, it's like if you that day off, when you come back, you either have to pick up where you left off or the team has to pick up the slack.
Yeah.
So you have to make sure they understand when you're gone.
Yeah, and you're not taking days off while you're on that particular project. It's when
You
that
can.
project is done.
You can,
Well,
but it's tough. It's tough.
yeah, it's a lot tougher.
Yeah. So I would say, yeah, like the pharma side is, because you're always cognizant of what's going on, it's a bit easier to predict. But sometimes, we had someone from our business development, search and evaluation team that essentially goes out to try to find other interesting opportunities, come through and say, hey, we think this is interesting. Can you quickly assess X, Y, and Z? Right. So, but we can say, yeah, we can do this for you by next week because we got all these things going on. And usually they're okay with it.
So how is your job changing with AI? AI is changing pretty much everything. It's drug development cycles, it's real world data. How is your particular job as an analyst, a scientific and competitive
Yep.
analyst? How is that changing?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to figure out the best ways to integrate it. So our team has a lot of sort of ongoing initiatives that we're working through. Um, Part of what we do, since we sort of act as an internal consultant, a lot of people will come to our site to try to find information they need for whatever they're doing. So we're trying to integrate it there rather than people always having to reach out to us and say, hey, can you point me in the direction of XYZ? Or hey, do you have a slide on this? They can just use the AI to find it because we've probably already built it. So that's one way, and we're sort of trying to work through the best way to do that. One of the other ways is because we always have to sort of be on the cutting edge of what's out there, we're trying to integrate it. Like, I always view it as a quote from The Breakfast Club.
Oh, wow. Dating yourself, Paul.
My brothers watch The Breakfast. So when the janitor guy comes through and he says, I am the eyes and ears of this institution, right? So I have to know, is there any kind of new clinical data that's out there? Is there any kind of new drug that might have filed to become an investigational new drug that might be, close to what we're developing? I have to keep an eye out on timelines. I have to keep an eye out on who's entering what space or who's buying what other company, right? So like it's a lot of data and it's a lot to get through it. And I do this daily to get through in a day. So trying to integrate AI in a way that it can help refine some of the data I might have to go through, using it to extrapolate or pull data out from things like conferences.
Mhm.
So, for example, there's going to be a conference coming up. There's a few things that we're interested in. We want to see if they're going to present data. We want to be able to take that data, integrate it into our what we call like a current tracker, where we're just monitoring, how do these things stack up against us or against other things out there, just to simplify that process. Um, but once again, the challenge is making sure it's accurate, right? Because we're sort of that last line of defense. We have to make sure it's accurate. So trying to figure out the best way to do that, I think, is the current challenge we're sort of having.
So, Paul, where do you go from here? What's your vision of promotion and progress and professional and personal development? Where do you want to go? Do you stay in house doing what you're doing? Do you go to more executive level positions, or what is your view of progression in your field?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to go to more executive level. That might take a little bit of time. I think one of the other aspects of like being in a large company, especially like a large pharmaceutical, is you get options to do projects. So, for example, one of the people that I'm working with, he was actually doing something completely different. There was a project option to come on our team. And I think for him, it might have been, let's say, 20 hours a week or 10 hours a week, something like that. So he was able to come over and he essentially learned all that stuff that we do. He's still here. I think he likes it. We get along pretty well. Um, and just to give other people out there, he was actually a pharmacist by training. He did an MBA, but I don't think that's necessary. I've chatted with him about MBAs. Um, and I think to me, I'm really curious to see what other roles are out there. I know right now I'm working on more of an earlier stage drug, but I know as drugs progress or as I get brought onto other teams, you might be working on, developing approaches to marketing later, right? So I might sort of see what's out there, at least for the time being, but I feel like having the uniqueness of one being a consultant where you sort of get to dip your feet in many pools, right? And then transitioning into a like pharmaceutical company where you can sort of do something similar, but also the fact that many other sort of functions within that company rely on getting your thoughts and inputs on what data is out there, et cetera. You can see what is also interesting there. So I think overall, it's kept doors open, and there are aspects that I've seen that are interesting to me. I don't know necessarily where I'm going to go next, though.
And that's the exciting part.
Yeah.
So we'll keep in touch and figure that out. Thank you, Paul. We're coming to the end of our time, and usually I'm asking for advice that you would give grad students that are thinking about careers in consulting and analyst positions. We kind of touched on that. I think doing the case competitions and getting as much experience and really leveraging that with their problem solving abilities that they are, clearly honed in their PhDs. Maybe we could just end on our note, which we end with all guests, is in 1 minute, I would like you to summarize in the way of a pitch of pitching a career in consulting and analysis in the biopharma sector to our listeners.
Yeah, so I think the way I would tend to think of it, hopefully I can keep it under a minute, is
I'll keep my eye on the time.
you have at least a large chunk of the skill set you're going to need. So it's somewhat of an easy jump, right? So to go into biopharma consulting or even what I currently do, you can handle the science. I'm not worried, right? And a lot of the other stuff you can pick up along the way. So what I would generally say is, you're from the perspective of doing these jobs, you're going to learn a lot. And I feel like a lot of people in academics, that's the way they are. They just want to always be learning. So it's another skill set you're going to learn. And it'll be easy to learn because you already know half the stuff you're probably going to need with the science. And it will open, in my opinion, a lot of doors, right? Because it's almost like having a dual degree in a way, right? You can do the science and you're just going to learn the business. And from the sort of analysis and consulting standpoint, like you're just getting so much experience so fast that it just you might find something that you find very intriguing that you want to go into more. So it might guide your career path a bit quicker. And if you don't, that's fine because you're just going to learn a lot. And overall, all that learning and all that experience will just make any kind of other career transition a lot easier. So I would say the step to consulting is generally, to me, a bit easier because you're always solving problems. You're doing something very similar. And then that will give you a bigger foundation to then figure out where you want to go next.
That's a great summary. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Dr. Paul Turgeon, thank you so much for demystifying the world of consulting.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Dr. Pam Plant.